Welcome back to Social Impact Live and our series on how ego impacts social impact and our ability to create change in the world. This is episode 3, and over the last several episodes we've been going through some of the different mindsets and the ways that ego shows up in our social impact work and how that affects the outcomes that we're able to achieve. On the last episode in particular, I talked about one of the most obvious forms of ego, which is where we become obsessed with our own ego, the image that we are creating, the somebodyness that we're putting together, the somebody that we're forming over here, and that becomes as much of a focus, if not more, than the social impact work and the outcomes that we are actually trying to achieve, or the intention behind those outcomes, even more clearly speaking. On this episode, I want to talk about a version of how ego shows up that's probably unexpected. Because for the people who manifest this style of ego, they probably don't actually think of it as ego in the first place, right? Ego is often associated with arrogance, with self-interest, with pride. But what I want to try to show you through this is that this other form of ego is also focused on the same thing. So just to remind you, ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. And really what we're talking about is how that sense of self-esteem and self-importance plays into the social impact work we do. One of the things that I've seen as a social entrepreneur who consults with other social innovators to try to help them amplify their impact and create more lasting change is a statement. A statement that I've heard from them, but I've also heard from tons of people who've sort of never headed down the path toward creating the type of change in the world that they want. And the statement is, who am I to insert verb, right? Who am I to create that sort of change? Who am I to be the one to speak on that topic? Who am I to be the one to do anything about that? Right? Who am I to lead? Who am I? And the way that this comes off for most of the people who are saying it, I think where it really comes from is actually a place of humility, a place of wanting to think of themselves not as the one who is able to do everything, which is in contrast to the version of ego that I told you yesterday, sort of a more hero complex style approach, but to say, I am not the only one who could do this, but rather it takes the form of, I might not be the person at all to do this. Who am I to take on that role? And then this conversation usually comes in the context of putting together a big vision for change. So there's this idea of a type of change that needs to happen in a given space. Let's imagine that it's healthcare, it's social determinants of health, it's something around health disparities in Black America, let's talk about. And someone will say, well, who am I to really create change in that? And they might be saying that for a number of reasons. They might be saying that because they themselves are not a Black person. They might be saying that because they think that there are others who are working on that issue. They might be saying that because they don't feel like they're fully equipped for it. They might be saying that because they know that others have been working on this for years. And so they say this statement as a way of saying, hey, I'm not trying to come in and take over anyone's territory necessarily, right? But the challenge with this statement is that it also carries within it a sedative effect, an effect that sedates the person who says it and who believes it into a state where they are less likely to act on the bold types of visions that are needed in order to truly create change in the systems that are most broken. And that impact is one that can be seen in the number of ideas and dreams that are sort of rotting on the shelf, that are sort of sitting there waiting to be touched or waiting to be activated in some way, but instead are sitting there and they're sort of starting to wither. Because the person who could have acted, who had the vision put together, could have gone out and begun to put together the steps to make that happen, but instead has talked themselves into a state of believing that they are not the right one to do it. They might have the vision, but someone else will come along to do it. So this sort of humility that creeps its way in as well, or maybe it's framed as humility, is actually, to me, at least this statement, is actually not humility at all. It is actually a lack of confidence. It's a lack of self-confidence in approaching a given issue. It's an insecurity about one's own position with respect to the issue that they want to address, or their ability to accomplish the vision that they have in their head. And so whenever it comes down to how ego fits into this, if we think of ego as a person's sense of self-esteem and self-importance, instead of it being an elevated form of ego, it is actually a diminished form of ego that affects their ability to create change or their belief in what is possible. When I was a kid, I told you that I was sometimes seen as someone who was cocky. I was sometimes seen as cocky or arrogant. I often thought of it as a confidence at the time. And it's become a lot more nuanced in my view as I look back at my past self or those manifestations of self. And I think there's truth to both sides of that now. But one thing that I used to say, that I used to believe, and that I still believe in, is that one of the greatest challenges that humanity faces is actually having the confidence in itself, in oneself, in order to create the type of change that is needed. The confidence in ourselves to be able to do more than what we've seen before, to be able to do more than what the boundaries of society seem to imply that we can do. Right? So many of us actually are limited by what we've seen as being possible. And what that means is that when we say, what job are we going to get when we grow up? We look and we say, well, maybe it's this job or this job or this job or these types of jobs because I've seen my parents do those jobs or I've seen people in my community do those jobs. When we ask, what are our family lives going to look like? Well, it could look like this or it could look like this because these are the versions that I've seen in my life. And often our dreams only extend as far as what we've seen around us. But when it comes to creating social change, we are trying to shift something into something that hasn't been seen before. So what that requires is to take that vision that we have, which I think we often think others have as well, but I don't know that that's always the case. To take that vision that we have and to have confidence in ourselves and our ability to begin to move toward that. The real issue here, the real challenge here, once we develop that confidence, is to find true humility within that at the same time. And to recognize that because we have that vision and because we see the path forward, doesn't necessarily mean that we are exceptional, that the soul of us, that the thing that we are made of becomes greater than or better than anyone else. But it does mean, perhaps, that we've been given a gift in this moment. We've been given a gift that may not have come to other people to be used in the same way. And so we shouldn't take it for granted, the fact that we have that vision or we have that idea or that we might have a passion for something, and that we thus might be exactly the person who needs to work on that issue. All right? So that's my story for you today. About how ego and social impact interact. And so far what we've gone through is we've talked about the somebodyness on episode 1 that we have all tried to create of ourselves. We've talked about the way that ego manifests when we think that we are in so many ways the one to do something, or we're focused more on that somebodyness that we're building than the impact itself. And now we've talked about the flip side of that, right? Where instead of ego being elevated, as I said in the last episode, ego is diminished, and it leads to a reduction in action and a sedative effect on what we can do. Tomorrow we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these topics and continue on this series around social impact. You're not going to want to miss this next episode because I'm going to talk a little bit more about another mindset, another method, another approach to this that people tend to embody when they think about creating social change. Another way the ego shows up. You're not going to want to miss it. All right, I will see you tomorrow on another episode of Social Impact Live. Thanks so much.